Before we get to the filmmaking part, there's a lot of mystery involved in first of all, how are things going now for the co-op?
Well, this is going to come back around, but there was a young woman from within the community. I was standing on the farm site, and she walked over. She lived a couple of blocks away, a young woman of color, and about towards the end of the summer. And she waved at me, and I said, "Come over." I was harvesting ground cherries. And so she came over, and she was like, "How did you get this lot?" And she was like, "I want to do urban farming, but I don't know how to get a lot like this." And I looked at her. I don't know why it was on my heart, but I looked at her as a younger person, and I said, "You vote." In fact, let me back up the story. She actually said, "I met you before and I heard you speak before, and you were right about everything. You were right about everything except for one thing." And I looked at her and I was laughing. I said, "What wasn't I right?" She said, "You told me to vote." And I said, "Yeah, you should vote." And she was like, "No, voting doesn't matter." I said, "You came up here and asked me how I got this lot." And I said, "And if you don't understand what voting had to do in political process and policy, and community advocacy had to do with getting this lot, then you have a longer road in front of you towards what you'd like to do for your community." So during the pandemic, we were able, now when the city was closed and nobody was in office, we were able to build over 42 beds, myself and a gentleman who lived next door to me, who was tired of seeing me out there struggling with trying to fit the wood together. But yeah, so we built over 42 beds, and that season we grew, I say 600 because we didn't have a scale, but we grew hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds of produce. And we were able to pack hundreds of bags of fresh produce for families in a socially distant way, for them to come pick up and drop off the shut-in seniors. And we did it so quietly. We did it so quietly. We also, in the house that's on a lot of people miss the whole point that that house was purchased by me.
Right.
With my farm money for Vermont. And not only were we able to grow food for the community and for shut-in seniors, but we are also able to take the first floor and implement the community co-op model and provide self-subsidized housing for women of color and students who were not able to get housing once their universities closed down.
That's
again,
unbelievable.
quietly done.
Unbelievable.
So we've been able to do the work now that we just have our raised beds and fix the first floor up for our community.
That's outstanding. Are there other, as part of the co-op, are you looking to have other lots to develop as well as the way that the young woman was talking about?
No.
No.
And it's. I struggle with this. I'm looking to transition out. This process has scarred me. And I was coming, I'm from Boston, but I had moved to Connecticut, Simsbury, Connecticut, to be exact, as a lower income woman to put my children in school, right, as a younger woman, and came back to Boston and noticed that there was a deficit in the community. And I opened a produce store called Milk and Honey Market. And that business association manipulated me into closing down my business. And it was just a succession of oppression within that community towards community design, healthy community design, that made me realize, not just through the lens of the documentary, but even before the documentary, it was my impetus to participate, that Boston is not as progressive as it represents itself. And can I do that work and build capacity in a city, a town, or a community that is more willing to guide towards a humanization of marginalized communities? So no, I don't think I'll do anything again in Boston.
Not in Boston, but you might elsewhere?
I definitely will elsewhere. One of the important things that I remind people is that Boston's also guilty of a cultural annihilation of African American communities. And I don't say this to have attack the conscience of people who may not live in diverse communities. Your community may have never been diverse. And that's okay, right? You can go to Raleigh-Durham. It doesn't say that it was ever diverse. But Boston has had a long history within the United States around abolition movements, around social justice movements, feminist movements. And those white and black men and women who were there, radical, leading the charge, are gone. And Boston is not allowing for a new culture of African American, whether they're intellectual or community members, to come up. And that was apparent in the 2020 census, that African American communities are the only community demographic in the city of Boston that is experiencing a loss or a deficit. And the community is still not ready to talk about that. And about where would I go, we're actually doing a screening with Amherst Reparations Council on December the 9th. Feel free to look for it on Eventbrite. And they're already doing the work around looking at reparations, not in the form of payment, but in the form of understanding that there need to be measures to support a community that's been marginalized and oppressed to the point of non-existence.
Well, that's spectacular, and that's in Amherst.
That is in Amherst. So I'm I'm looking at Amherst like, let me. I want to make space with you, right?
Yeah,
definitely.
So let's talk a little bit about the film, if we can.
Sure.
First of all, the timeline just interested me. When the film picks up, and it obviously starts out to be a film about the Clementi course. But as he's following you and Carl specifically, we start to see you moving towards farming on the land, on the lot that you started out on, right? And so was that already in play before you started taking the Clementi course? And how did you find your way to the Clementi course?
I had already started. I had no intention of doing urban farming or social justice work or community advocacy. I was explaining to a friend who drove down with me that in all actuality, I'm somewhat of an introvert. I'm a Taurus and I'm an introvert, and I was explaining taurine things, which include comfort and a mild laziness sometimes that's wrapped in comfort. But yeah, so oddly enough, I was educating myself in agriculture and environmental justice and climate change towards moving to Vermont. And I was seeing that women in my community didn't have that privilege to leave that space. And I knew it was a privilege that even though I didn't have an education, the highest grade that I graduated was middle school. I attended 2 months of high school. I got my GED when I was 38 at Quincy High School. And I put 3 children through college. And one's an electrician now, my son Robert, and the other 2 are doing fairly well for themselves, my daughters. The violence that I experienced growing up as a woman in foster care, growing up as a woman in detentional services, growing up as a teenage mother, I had my first child when I was 16. I kind of looked at my community and was just like, it's time for me to leave. And I was training to do agriculture and talking about how to integrate women of color in urban agriculture as I was leaving to go to rural agriculture. And for all the people who applauded me going into rural agriculture, I thought that they would take up the charge of incorporating Black women into urban agriculture, but they weren't. And I was sending these long, drawn-out emails, and nobody was responding to this, like, let's teach women about climate change and environmental justice, and local food movements and food sovereignty and land sovereignty with all these empty lots. And people who I saw at conferences in Boston, academics, and 501c3s were not responding to these emails. And I started to internalize my lack of education. And I started to feel maybe because I'm not educated, it's coming across in the emails. So, and I was carrying that with me, and it was actually silencing me. Until one day I was standing at a bus stop and I saw the poster for the Clemente program. So I enrolled thinking that in the humanities I would learn to write better and read better and speak better, whatever that meant. And was educated in philosophy and arts and Socrates and the question of what is just and unjust. Would we be the ring of Gyges? What it is to be a citizen? What it is to flourish, not just live. What we owe each other. So I was already doing the work, and Clemente and the humanities program sharpened the perspective to say this is what we as a society are asked to do for each other.
No, that's a perfect fit, obviously, for what you're doing, and the film brings that out, that the philosophical issues that are behind the unjust situation that we're seeing in your attempts to get through the governmental situation.
It was, can I just mention
please.
this? Because this is so funny. It was weird because I was squatting on land and teaching women how to take over these lots, and my history professor from Harvard, and we're in Dorchester, right? All Black, lower resource community, lower income community. And he's asking me to write my thesis for Antigone. And I'm sitting there and he said, write your thesis question for Antigone. And I said, I can't. And he's looking at me, he said, Kofi, you've read this. What is your thesis question for Antigone? What is Antigone's dilemma? And all of the professors are staring at me. And I was just like, I don't know. He said, what is Antigone's dilemma? So not even seeing myself in philosophy, what is my dilemma as a Black woman who's trying to go? And what do I owe my community before I leave? So that's the funny part about philosophy. I couldn't figure out what Antigone's dilemma was.
Well, you had other things on your mind, obviously.
Yes.
So let's talk again about the film. We know from the synopsis ahead of time about the film, but we don't know in the film itself. The filmmaker never talks about the fact that he made you and Carl producers. And then we see at the end credits that you became producers. So, but that's not addressed in the film. So you could tell us how that came about and what that meant to you, and how did that work?
Yeah, and I advise you to keep tuning into this documentary and using it as a tool. James, it was hard for James, and I was watching James struggle as he was witnessing violence. And he's a very, very kind man. You know, he has his privileges, he has his community, but he's not disconnected, right? And he came in there, I think, wanting to document me and then finding himself perplexed in some situations and questioning why. And there were times when I would explain to him why in our community things were different in his community that had nothing to do with the hypothesization of the Black experience, right? That where that society tells us, a racist society, a biased society tells us that lower income communities don't want to do better. And it was something that James was informed in, or maybe indoctrinated into, like, passively. And he couldn't reconcile that there were people that he was meeting, women within this organization every single day, and men and community members that were cleaning up their street. And it was nothing of like what he believed to be the case in Newton, Massachusetts. And he struggled. He struggled when I brought him to the homelessness unit at the welfare department. He struggled he would tell you how he struggled sitting in housing court watching women get up in front of a judge unrepresented to be evicted. He would tell you how he struggled watching the city shut us out of public meetings. He struggled that possibly me being evicted and losing my housing was retributional. He struggled with why there were so many academic Black men and women who were humbled to this experience of this documentary, but some of his community just didn't get it. And I had to bring in a team of people to help him understand, not to judge him for it, but to bring him closer into the issues so that he could understand. And I think what he realized with the lack of equality and equity, if you would ask him, he decided, as we were trying to educate him, that we deserved the rights to be co-producers, as we were helping not just educate him, but in the documentary, educate communities who would be better informed about our experiences. He was thoughtful enough to provide us equity. And the co-producer's credits are his form of equity and what he could do from where he was at. So that's why you see us as co-producers, just in our community intention to be honest and give you an honest and authentic depiction of what are the experiences in our lives, our personal experiences, and how the city relates to us, and to communicate that back.
Well, and it's absolutely correct for you guys to be co-producers. I understand what you're saying about how he wanted to give that to you. But because the movie changes from what it started out to be, which is about the Clementi course, and then it becomes about your personal stories, your personal narratives. And Carl's is very different from yours, but they're both exactly the opposite of what he might have expected coming into the Clementi course, because it's for disenfranchised people, people marginalized in different ways, out of incarceration, homelessness, and other situations. So here are people that are articulate, impassioned, working to change lives and accepting certain things and not accepting other things, so that it becomes a movie about you guys and about what your struggles are, and not so much about Clementi, although he keeps circling back to that as a good documentary filmmaker. And there is the interweaving between your experience and the Clementi course, as you said. So that not only you're co-producers, you're basically co-directors.
Yeah, and we didn't know anything. We're not from the arts world. I literally am a trained and educated rural and urban farmer who decided in extending, and to explain, for James to understand what it meant for us to create a cooperative and what it meant for what cooperatives meant to me. The shared collective work, right, of community liberation, that everybody can contribute in some manner, and it's not financial, right? And why I felt that in moving towards a social justice and a community betterment, how we all need to be involved in that. And I want to think that some of that dropped into, you know, James's teacup one morning. Like, we all need to be part of this movement of this understanding, right, towards a sincerely just society, not something that happens overnight, but the small steps towards it. It's a small step. And also, I think that James understood when you had women in the Clementi course, which is not shown in a documentary, who spoke of growing up in cities and towns in the South and having redacted books, academic books.
That's not even good to believe, but there it is.
There were women who talked about what I've never seen a redacted book, but there were women sitting there who talked about having redacted books. And those women were also the women who were in homeless shelters. Those were some of the same women when the professor would ask them about their housing situations, If they had contacted their congressman or their senator or any organization, they would just say no. So how does the denial or the disconnect or the intentional disconnect from education or from the rigors of academia, right? How does that contribute to, again, undergirding a community suppression that can be generational at times?
Yeah, well, it's written in black and white. If you refuse to educate people, then how are they supposed to make a change? So,
and
yeah.
how, if we're dealing in a time when we're thinking about there's a national movement, and I maybe am thrown into the political realm, but I'm not necessarily a political person, right? I understand its form and function, but when we talk about educating ourselves on the history of the United States and educating up-and-coming generations so that we can move past these things that are so trauma-laden and guilt-laden for all communities, right? How do we then say that we're going to redact our history? And this is what we want to talk about, and these are things that we don't want to talk about, because the Holocaust is subjective, right? Lynchings are subjective, right? Indigenous land loss, we're not sure if it happened like that, right? And it's a part of suppressing. It's a part of suppression towards a communal understanding of where we're coming from and what is needed to help each other go forward.
Yeah, well, that absolutely has to change, and I hope that this can be part of that. This process can be part of that. So just getting back again to film, since this is a documentary festival, you certainly learned a lot about filmmaking by being involved in this process for so long, because you were on camera quite a bit.
I was on camera. That does not automatically default to better understanding.
But you can't be on camera without seeing how it's being done, right?
Yeah, to an extent. Well, James had turned into the great Oz behind the curtain because he would go home and say, "Coffee, I'm editing." But yeah, and showing us the rough cuts, Carl and I, to say, can we talk about Charles Stewart? Can we talk about Louise Day Hicks and busing? Boston has been segregated in my lifetime, and definitely in Cassandra's lifetime. There have been parts of the city we couldn't go, and James didn't know that. James didn't realize that the city was segregated in my lifetime. So to say, this is Thompson's Island, but while we were standing in South Boston at the boathouse, we weren't allowed to go in and buy ice cream, and we were told by our parents to wait in a car because people would throw rocks at us and call us nigger if the boat took too long to get to the dock to get us to the island in my lifetime when I was 10 and 11. So, but James didn't know that, and a lot of black people do not talk about that. In fact, I can even say that the history of that may be suppressed in Boston.
Well, that's incredible. But so what you're saying is that you're not going to become a filmmaker?
No, not at all. No, I'm going back to farming and agriculture and creating and designing safe space. I believe that we can be a better society. There are other talks where I am more clear and honest that although I tell them I have lost hope, but I'm not clear with saying I've lost hope. I may have lost hope in Boston, but I do have hope that there are other communities where we can better thrive, but for agriculture. But no, I mean, I don't even know how to use a camera on an iPhone. My daughters are always saying, "Let me turn the camera around."
So if you were to make progress in the next iteration of what you're going to do, right? Mm-hmm. So would you call James and say, "Hey, come on, make a documentary about this"?
I doubt it. You know, no. It's tempting, but I remember James feeling badly about realizing that he was a witness and having to communicate what he had witnessed. I also realized I couldn't be in the room with Tolga. Tolga and I have been friends since we were 11 years old at Thompson's Island. And she had never been able to talk about her son's murder. And in fact, when I went to the funeral, she was standing across the street, far away from Mount Hope Church. I saw her standing there smoking a cigarette, and it just reminded me of me waiting for her when we were younger and we would go to the store, to the mall, and to have to walk over to her and to bring her into the church to her son's funeral, to her child's funeral. So to watch that, I don't know, and I commend the bravery of James and an intention to tell a very real story and to use his camera, as we do in documentaries, as you do in documentaries, to bring truth and justice to the experiences and to connect to experiences. I don't know if I could have held that camera or talked to Tolga. And James exists in my mind as a friend, but I realize as he talks that he's done other pieces of work that were just as important as this one. And that he's been doing foundational work in a very quiet, transformative way to talk about the unheard and unseen communities, whether it's white farmers in Ohio or Black women who are dealing with homelessness and using cooperative works as a way to stabilize. So I don't know if I could do that. I will leave it up to the other filmmakers, but I will always be a consultant of the community.
Well,
Send me an email.
Well, it's a good one. It's a very good thing to be. So can you tell us just a little bit about your list of people that you gave special thanks to at the end?
When I'm at Harvard and MIT, they often ask me, because they're the community, who did help you? And who in the city did help you? And the list is so short. I think people like the Tuskegee interns. That Tuskegee, I realized that there weren't any communities of Black farmers. It's not a large community here in the Northeast, and they sent interns. I thanked the Norwegian man who taught me how to say thank you in Swedish when I was at Swiss Next, talking about environmental justice and greenhouse development and what they were doing in Switzerland and Germany. My children who were patient, just people who helped. One other thing is that we almost lost the house because the city wouldn't let us grow and we weren't a nonprofit. There were people who made donations, and I couldn't believe it, standing there at my mailbox in tears, trying to figure out who had dropped an envelope in there that helped me pay for the bills on the first floor. So the list is people who silently and sometimes covertly assisted the women and I in moving forward. And sometimes it's the smallest steps that deserve the acknowledgement just as much as great ones.
Well, that's a beautiful sentiment and very true. Overall, just it's a complete triumph. I'm just so glad to hear how it worked out for you, because, as you say, you may have given up hope for Boston, but at the end of the film, we're left with you not sure of whether you can make it work, whether it's going to happen. You know, so you're sort of feeling a little bit defeated, and there's at the end of the film, it's more of a triumph for Carl, and it's more of a middle ground for you. So,
yeah.
But I think that's the perseverance that you showed, and well as the just keeping going in spite of everything. I'm so glad that it turned out the way that it did.
Thank you. And I would like to say there are still challenges. I don't talk about the challenges as much, but Carl still has not found housing. The city has still not given him housing, and he's not doing very well at all. At all. And he sent an email, and I had asked him if he needed anything, and his response back recently was just for prayers. Oh. So he's not doing well at all. And about the land, as that land was moved for community design and healing while my counterpart is failing in
Right.
health. That hopefully with this new administration that we can do some fundraising to purchase the land, that they're more open to selling us the land, because the city refused to enter into negotiations about selling the land. And probably the only update I'd ask you guys in Cooperative Works to subscribe to our cooperative, to keep an eye on us. I don't feel that we are in that much of a danger as we were in the last administration to lose the land. But to talk about what our impact is and to acknowledge when I disappear on the side of a mountain, that project of handing over that house and that land to the women in the community while I go find the space that I will call forever space for communities of mine that don't mind living more rurally.
That's great. So how do we keep track of your cooperative? What's the way to do that?
You can, there's 3 ways. You can either go to our website, which is Common Good Co-op, Common Good Cooperative with an S.com, Common Good Cooperatives with an S. You can go to the Reckoning in Boston website and click on my link, and it clicks to a page. And then also, we're trying to get over the last edge of a crowdfunder to hire an attorney to help us with the city's inability to legally know how to sell us the land, so they say.
So where is the crowdfund site on the Reckoning in Boston site?
It should be, and if you can't find it, it should be on I Fund Women under Common Good, the Common Good Project.
Okay.
So yeah, we've been using those funds, well, I've been using those funds to do business planning for the women, to create a strategic plan, their business plan for the co-op, their legal advice on how to create an equity-based co-op, which who knew most co-ops are not equity-based, and to figure out how the equity in the co-op of the land continues to be an investment as a benefit corporation. We are also a B Corp towards the women in the community who will be there longer than I will.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming down to talk
Thank
to us.
you.
It just really rounds out everything about the film. It's a big
Thank you
effort
for
on your part.
waiting. I appreciate it. Thank you for waiting. And thank you for your interest in this subject and for staying here and sitting with us.
Oh, no, happy to do it. So glad you came down.